Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Charles Waldheim. It's my pleasure to serve as the John E. Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where I direct the school's Office for Urbanization. I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague, Sarah Page, who is a research associate leading our work on Cape Ann. The Cape Ann Conversations is an occasional series of webinars focused on climate adaptation on a variety of topics, organized in collaboration with our friends on Cape Ann, Town Green, Water Alliance, and the 4 municipalities. We've also enjoyed support from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Joan Fitzgerald. Joan Fitzgerald is Professor of Urban Public Policy at Northeastern University. Her research examines urban climate action and strategies for equity, economic development, and innovation. In her most recent book, Greenovation, Dr. Fitzgerald argues that the climate strategies of most cities represent relatively random, disaggregated acts of greening rather than a more integrated or aggressive set of actions. Dr. Fitzgerald is active in a variety of roles, including a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of the Boston Globe. Dr. Fitzgerald joins us this afternoon to talk about the context of governance for coastal resilience in the context of Massachusetts and Cape Ann. Dr. Fitzgerald, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun to prepare for. It's been a while since I did the report. Now let's see my screen. I'm not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So what I have to say today is based on a report that I led a team doing in 21 and 22 for the Boston Foundation. It was the inaugural Boston Climate Progress Report. And to my knowledge, it is the first external assessment of a city's climate action in the country that has occurred. And the significance of that is that many cities do updates on their climate plan, how much progress they've made on a goal, whether it's in process, but not really the assessment of what are the barriers, and particularly what are the barriers given the limited set of tools that cities have to act. So in doing this report, we did one large report, but then we broke that down into what we called 4 big lifts. And these were areas that we thought that were essential to getting a handle on right away. So the first one was retrofitting the small building stock, mostly in the mitigation sphere, although we know flood-proofing buildings is important, but this was more retrofitting for energy efficiency. Then there was local energy planning for an electrified city. This does get into some resilience issues. Many of you may be familiar with the siting of a distribution station in East Boston that was controversial, 1, for where it was in the neighborhood, and 2, because of its vulnerability. Big lift 3, Big Lift 3 was the one I'm going to talk about today, building a resilient coastline through improved governance, where we made recommendations on what the state needed to do. And then the 4th one was kind of where a lot of my passion lies, in prioritizing reparative planning for frontline neighborhoods. And I think it's for Boston's frontline neighborhoods, but it applies just about anywhere. So what I'm going to focus on first is what we're doing, which is mostly local action, and why local action isn't enough. So Massachusetts is a particularly vulnerable state because much of its 1,500 miles of coastline had consisted of low-lying salt marshes and estuaries before pre-European settlement. Now it's home to 78 cities and towns that are very vulnerable. There's a Massachusetts coastal flood zone model that estimates the probability of flooding in 50 years. And if you look at it, the areas correspond almost exactly to where our ancestors filled in the coastal marshes and shallow bays for development. So what we have in Massachusetts is this long, low-lying coast, thousands of public and private owners on that coast, and and lots of different infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, food, energy, wastewater. So pretty significant problem that we have here. Coastal flooding differs from inland flooding in two significant ways. The first one is that it's far more corrosive than fresh water. And so that makes it incompatible with electrical systems like the one I just mentioned and other critical infrastructure. And the second is the ocean really is of infinite volume. So once it starts coming in, it's really hard to stop it, whether with barriers or nature-based solutions. So the fact is, no community, Boston included, in Massachusetts, has raised enough public funds nor proposed the regulatory structure required to tackle this enormous public works problem. To date, coastal flooding resilience has largely occurred through market rate private redevelopment of waterfront property. And this strategy actually accelerates inequity by either leaving out or gentrifying existing coastal communities. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go on. So after completing this report, a group of people, experts in various aspects of coastal resilience, had a series of 2 meetings with Climate Chief Melissa Hoffer and key staff in related agencies to talk about what we thought needed to be done at the state level or the regional level to tackle resilience. And my understanding is that the Commonwealth is going to be releasing a plan imminently, and we really look forward to seeing that plan. I was hoping it would come out before this talk, so we could see how much of the recommendations appear in that plan. So let's start looking at some of the reasons why coastal resilience can't be city-led, and what are some possible strategies for leaving it. So the first thing we encountered, whether you're Gloucester, whether you're Boston, insufficient staffing. Climate change has been on the agenda for most cities, maybe since 2008. And what most cities have done is just used existing staff to tackle the problem, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and not added a lot. So when you're talking about coastal resilience, a lot of planning has to go into it, and many cities don't really have the planning to keep this on track. Perhaps in my interviews with city staffers when we were doing the study, this was one of the things that was emphasized the most, is that, oh, you think a city has a coastline, the city can control the whole thing and figure out how to do that. Just looking at Boston's 47 miles of coastline, there's 350 separate parcels. So Boston has prepared 5 neighborhood plans on coastal resilience, but given that there's limited ability to act on some of the coastline. So here are 2 examples where Boston owned property and was able to build more resilient areas. And you can see a mixture of constructed barriers here and nature-based solutions in these. So in here is the constructed barriers, and then we see that it builds up in the green spaces for absorbing water in this one, and similarly here where it builds up, and it's built up from the water. So on selected parcels, the city of Boston is able to do that. I apologize for my breaking up voice. I have a chest cold today. On property the city owns, other things it can do is zoning. one of the key powers of a city. And so every city in Boston or in Massachusetts should be looking to zone in a way to make the city more flood-proof. So this was passed, this zoning overlay district in Boston in 2021, and it's designed to protect those areas that are at risk of a 1% chance storm event in 2070 with 40 inches of sea level rise. So that's a way off. What it does, it extends beyond the FEMA designated floodplain. It covers about 5,000 acres of land at risk from coastal flooding. So in Boston, this includes the Seaport, Chinatown, the South End, East Boston, South Boston, North Boston, and Dorchester, and other areas. It covers about 85,000 people and about $85 billion in real estate. And so the guidelines are rigorous, but there's some problems with this approach, design problems that come up. First of all, the height requirements for new buildings are higher. So the first floor. So that's going to mean that new buildings will be much higher than their neighbors. And the current street leading to kind of an unappealing street level view that will have to be addressed some way. Some also question whether the requirements sufficiently consider potential flooding, like we saw with Hurricane Sandy or Ida. City can adapt the code to address some of these concerns. But one of the big problems is because much of this area, if you look at the South Boston waterfront, the Seaport, much of that is already developed. So in terms of, the question is, maybe it's too little too late to really address the problem. Another design that the city has come up with, and I think here again, many cities along the Massachusetts coastline are looking for designs like this, where it's a graduated, this is Moakley Park, the design, it's a graduated slope. And there's, they've designed it so that the whole beachfront has public activities, really just a well done, well-designed park. But the logistical and legal challenges that the city has for this one park are just astounding. And I'd like to just read from the report for you because I can't keep all these in the top of my head. It is going to require coordinating with the state, which owns all the surrounding roads and land for this. The proposed plan also calls for removing the state-owned Day Boulevard, which currently separates the park from Carson Beach. That's managed by the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, and that's part of the Metropolitan Park System of Greater Boston. So while the assets are managed by the Urban Parks and Recreation Division, any design updates to the parkways and roads within the system have to be approved by DCR's Bureau of Engineering. So I don't know if you're keeping count, but that's 4 agencies so far that are involved. So if that's not enough, Day Boulevard is protected under state's Article 97, which is an amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution that prevents state-owned assets from being used or disposed of for any purposes without the majority vote of the Conservation Committee, the City Council, approval of the mayor, and a 2/3 vote of both the House and state legislature. Then it's zoned in the city as Boston as an open space district. It's on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the Frederick Law Olmsted Old Harbor Reservation Parkways. And so open space districts are defined by the City of Boston zoning ordinances as prohibiting the development of open space land and requiring development reviews. So in short, the city's desire to remove Day Boulevard would require numerous state agencies, city actors, a very time-intensive process. And that's once the money is obtained for building it. And so right now, the Day Boulevard part of it has been dropped out of the plan because of that complexity. And so what this illustrates in terms of governance at the state level is we've got to figure out a way when we have designs like this that are really effective and really work to expedite how we go about permitting and regulating that so that these can be built in a timely fashion. There's also the problem of disagreement over strategies and different layers of disagreement. So we have between the state and the city, within the city, different disagreement. So in Boston, like every city in the Commonwealth, has a downtown waterfront planning initiative going on. And what happened with Boston's is the state Supreme Judicial Court struck down the 42-acre waterfront development plan, meaning that they have to start all over again. And why this happened is the SJC ruled that state officials have long been approving these plans improperly by simply having the state environmental secretary sign off on them instead of having the full review by the Department of Environmental Protection as state law requires. So that decision not only affected Boston, but probably 17 other municipal harbor plans around the state. And I think Gloucester is one of those as well as New Bedford. So there again, it's who gets the final sign-off is a problem there. Another aspect of disagreement over strategies has to do with constructed barriers versus nature-based solutions. And my view on this, it shouldn't be either or, it's both and. But this was one that John Sullivan at the Boston Water and Sewer Commission has proposed here, where with this new bridge, what you would have is a storm surge barrier tucked underneath it. And what that would do then is obviously go down and make this area kind of a bathtub. And then, that could be these could be closed then. And so, as he points out here, you still have navigation in the channel. The city is not wild about this idea and argues that if they use nature-based solutions around that Fort Point channel, you wouldn't have as much water going into it. So there's debate over how much of the nature-based versus the barrier strategy should be employed. Another aspect of this is that coastal protection is very expensive. There's looking at New York, talking about $52 billion to save the whole New York City metropolitan area. Boston, probably $1.6 billion is an underestimate of the cost of that. And as I mentioned before, no city has been able to raise those kind of funds. Just to look at this graph, it shows for 4 of the plans in Boston, the estimated cost of the key projects in them and what they have to raise. And so for each project, then the city has to look to federal funding, to state funding to come up with the amount of money. And so, like with Joe Moakley Park, you can have the greatest plans for what to do, but until they assemble the financing, not much can be done to complete those. I mentioned earlier about the 370 properties, and the property owners can also plan, and the property owners should. The Wharf District in Boston has its own planning group, and they meet regularly. They had money from the state in order to develop a plan. And so they've got a plan that defends property in their corner of the seaport. But this is a good thing, but it's also a problem in that, the properties abutting it then don't have that kind of sea level protection. So what we need is more public-private partnership so that it's an integrated plan for the entire area. So you have to go with what you have, right? And plan accordingly. But I always think of when the seaport, when I see it, as shoulda, coulda, woulda in terms of what happened. And this is a series from the Globe that looked at it and said, look at this completely almost uninhabited area of the city. And there was a rare opportunity to build a new neighborhood for all Bostonians. And instead, what was built was the seaport. And not only is it problematic in terms of its vulnerability to sea level rise, but as the Globe points out, it's even whiter than the old part of Boston. So they've built a very high-end, exclusive area that's very vulnerable. And I question, did this have to be this way? So many others question too. This is on the left, an article from Bloomberg saying Boston built a new waterfront just in time for the apocalypse, and shows it. And then here we have another article, the seaport costs billions to build. What will it take to save it? And so I think the lesson for other cities as you develop and towns is it's a lot cheaper to plan it beforehand than it is to try to retrofit after the fact. And for many years, I've been following the seaport versus Hafen City, which is an area of Hamburg, Germany. And so if you look at where Hafen City is, you can see on the river, it's very vulnerable to flooding. And what did they do? Well, they developed a master plan and they stuck to it. And Boston had a couple master plans for the seaport, but didn't really follow those plans as development started. And, you know, politics gets in the way of this as well. This was under Tom Menino as mayor, and he had a vision of this too, as kind of an eco-district area, but couldn't get a few property owners to sell. And this was part of his legacy. He wanted to move on it, and building started before they can do anything. So as they developed these districts of Hafen City, the first thing they did was raise it 8 meters. And so imagine if someone had had the foresight to do that. And I interviewed a lot of people who were involved in the beginning of the seaport development. And what they argued was, well, we just didn't see it coming. We hadn't had Hurricane Sandy. And I guess, you know, if you didn't see it, you didn't see it. But Hamburg saw it, and partly because they had a flood. And so maybe it does take a Hurricane Sandy. Maybe it does take a flood to really take that kind of planning seriously. But this was Cairo Shen, who was then at the time director of BPDA, or what was then BRA, saying planning in Boston is more of a contextual exercise. So my advice to any other city is don't let planning be a contextual exercise. Don't let developers rule what happens, because you'll get very vulnerable real estate. So here's just a few pictures of the planning that went into Hafen City. So you can see along the coast how it's here on the riverbank, how it's raised. And then the public space is here, and that is raised up there. So there's where you get the 8 meters, is this is raised, and then this all raised, and then the building. So in many ways, it's not unlike the seaport, except that it sits a lot higher than the seaport. Here's another view of it's still under development. The last time I was there, but this park was just opening. And here you see it again, the gradual raising of the land to make it less vulnerable. So now what Boston is doing is looking at how it's going to flood-proof the seaport. And what you see here is, you know, there's a number of, new building strategies, vertical seawalls, raising the harbor walk, constructing new ground, living shoreline. And and it's going to be very expensive and not as effective as what Hamburg did, but you can't undo that. So this raises a number of questions about how we move forward. And so the first issue is overdevelopment versus retreat. And I would argue we had overdevelopment in Boston. We have overdevelopment in Miami. And a lot of the coastal United States on the East Coast, the development is going on as if sea level rise wasn't part of it. There's a couple cities that are starting to take it seriously, and one is Norfolk, Virginia. And it's both got sea level rise and sinking land, which makes it extremely vulnerable. The advantage that Norfolk has in being the canary in the coal mine for the United States is it also has the world's largest Navy base there. And so that is quite an asset that the United States government is not going to let go. So there's going to be more federal money. But it's quite a story of how it happens gradually. The mayor has to solve the problem for the places that are flooding. And, you know, some of it's raising houses, some of it's raising roads. And what they were finding is all this investment that they did a year or two later, stormwater's coming in again. And so you're chasing good money after bad in trying to rebuild. And so one of the things that Norfolk is realizing is that they're not going to be able to save every neighborhood. And they have to seriously think about how to go about making those decisions. Here's an article from The Conversation about managed retreat done right can reinvent cities. So they're better for everyone. And so we're starting to see, at least in the academic community, discussions about managed retreat and how to do it right. But politically, it's not something politicians want to address and deal with. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's enormous equity concerns about this. So how do we start talking about managed retreat? So A.R. Siders, I'll get into her other article. The Conversation is a place where academics publish approachable versions of articles. So she was at Harvard. I believe she was in your division, Charles, maybe.
She spent some time on campus, and we definitely were happy to engage with AR.
Yeah. And so I'll get to her main article. But what she's talked about is just looking at different strategies, getting them out there, visualizing so people can see what it would look like. So you can elevate the way Hafen City of Hamburg did. You can build up a wall, maybe, if you want to, some kind of hybrid approach, which is what Boston is suggesting. So there's different ways to think about it. But in an article in Science, she talked about there being a need for strategic and managed climate retreat. And so the question is, why, where, when, and how should communities relocate? There are already, the Georgetown Climate Center has produced a managed retreat toolkit, and it introduces a process. Because above all, if you're talking managed retreat, it has to be community-based and driven and supported. And so frontline communities living and working on the coast are being disproportionately impacted by sea level rise. And it shouldn't be a matter of just those communities then having to retreat. So we really have to start engaging in these kind of questions of what point do we do managed retreat? And how do we make those decisions? To my knowledge, there's no places in Massachusetts that are actually engaging in those conversations. And so the idea here, as you can imagine, is just you abandon the areas that are susceptible to repeated disasters in favor of those that are safe. But you do that in a deliberate and thoughtful and planned way. So, we'll see how far we get in having these discussions. We're not going to be moving Boston to Worcester anytime soon. But as we think about, moving people and how many people, you do have to think about what are the infrastructure needs of moving people from one place to another. So that raises another very thorny issue in all this versus the public good versus private property rights. So who gets to decide whether we have managed retreat and under what conditions? I was like looking at this photo after which hurricane? I'm trying to think which one it was. Maybe it was Irene. My husband and I were walking on Ballston Beach in Truro, and there was a house for sale at the entrance to the beach, not unlike this kind of house. And it wasn't this bad, toppled over, but there were stilts holding it up. And I looked at him and I said, oh my goodness, those poor people, there they are trying to sell that house. Well, a month later, they sold that house for $2 million. And the person rehabbed it and moved it a little and has moved it again, as it is their right as a property holder. But at what point, either by insurance companies not insuring it or cities zoning and saying, no, you can't move that house anymore that close? And these kind of questions are popping up all over on the Cape. I'm sure they are in the North Shore of Massachusetts as well. And so the question is, at what point does the city get to use eminent domain to make those decisions? New Jersey has been using it. It's been very controversial. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been using eminent domain. And so that's another point of decision that's going to be controversial along with managed retreat is to when cities and any level of government can use eminent domain. And then, of course, there are the equity issues of who gets protected. And that's played out in Boston with East Boston, which is, of course, one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods. Early in the Wu administration, they announced that they're going to prioritize East Boston over downtown Boston. And that was a controversial decision in that, it's all one coastline. How do you just prioritize one area? And of course, they could implement the plans there first, but cities are grappling with this. Do you protect the area that's got $6 billion worth of real estate? Do you protect the communities? Which one gets protected first in terms of with what funding is available? And of course, the other problem we have with local approaches to this is that water doesn't respect jurisdictional borders. So we have Boston Harbor. And if you recall, when there were all kinds of calls to put a barrier here, well, gee, what happens to the areas outside of that barrier? The water has to go somewhere. So actions one city can take can affect another. And you see here, we've got the whole of Cape Cod Bay. Do we treat that as a region with some kind of regional planning body? And this is a region, and maybe this as a region in doing our coastal protection. But it all is one coast. Is there a way of dividing that and making regional decisions is a question. So a few of us got together after this report and did an op-ed in the Boston Globe saying we need a coastal adaptation agency. The piecemeal cities and towns working together just isn't working. And we need to get started on this quickly. And we saw it a real opportunity with the Healy administration, with the appointment of Melissa Hoffer as the climate chief, the first climate chief this Commonwealth has had, and then started these meetings with several people at the state level, including Melissa Hoffer. And we argued that, again, because of the expense and because of the issues that I raised, excuse me, that we needed some kind of proposed governance agency. And we looked at a couple of options. This one's obviously very Boston focused. It would be more of a regional governance agency that has come out of John Sullivan's work at Boston Water and Sewer Commission. But that you would see, obviously, the T has to be involved. They have a lot of vulnerable infrastructure. The Boston Redevelopment Agency, planning and redevelopment agencies, other municipalities, the city of Boston, the MWRA, the Water Resources Authority, Mass Department of Transportation. So all of these have to have input into this idea of a Massachusetts Coastal Defense Agency that would coordinate for the state. And it would have quite a bit of power. It would have funding and financing power to go ahead with the projects, planning ability to plan like we saw with Moakley Park, engineering capacity to actually undertake some of the studies needed on this, regulatory authority on zoning and other things, determining when and how quickly things get built. And then the most controversial one is whether it would have eminent domain authority. And that would probably be a big sticking point for many people. So looking at this, to be more specific, one of the things we proposed in that was something like the Massachusetts Water and Resources Authority, the MWRA. And if you don't know the history of that, an organization with powers like that could become this state agency for Massachusetts. In fact, we can stop sharing now and just talk. It's an example of a very high functioning agency that was developed to solve a particular regional problem, and that was the Boston Harbor cleanup. And so MWRA hired a separate staff, and that was their whole job. And they focused on that. And then when their job was done, that division no longer existed. And it includes many of the powers that I listed in the last slide. And in terms of funding, the MWRA raises dedicated funds through water and sewer bills. So that would be part of the funding, as well as federal and state funding as well. It also has bonding authority and an excellent bond rating, which would make that type of agency good to play this role. In terms of planning, a regional authority then could work with communities to identify critical areas to defend against flood damage, prioritize those along the coast, keeping in mind the needs of all the communities, and prioritizing those and deciding on managed retreat, which ones would be returned to coastal marshes or other flood resilient uses, and which ones would be protected for the developments that's there. So having an agency like that, they could take a holistic systems approach to managing the flooding to ensure resiliency is implemented in the most cost effective and equitable manner. Also having engineering capacity in being able to manage infrastructure projects from design studies going forward to the permitting, to the financing, construction, and then providing the ongoing maintenance. But having that in one would streamline kind of the process that we saw is hindering things in the Moakley Park example. When the MWRA was established in 1984, it was state legislature which established it and gave it the authority to provide these wholesale services to cities and towns, and then the cities and towns managed their own water and sewer. So that share power respects the home rule culture of our cities, and seems like that would be a good precedent for coastal resilience. So again, whether it has eminent domain would be something to be decided. And so that's basically, where we came down on what the city or what the state needs to do. And again, all I can say is the state says it's imminent. They're going to announce an approach to coastal resilience. And I'm eager to see what they come up with. And until then, I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in a conversation with the people in the meeting.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Joan. Particularly given how you're feeling today, I really appreciate that. And I promised Joan I'd give her a moment to enjoy her spindrift and get her voice back. So for those of you that want to ask a question or make a comment, please type it into the chat. You can also raise your hand, and Sarah will unmute you, and we'll get to some questions. But I do want to, kind of just draw out a few of the themes, what I heard, but also, some of the questions that I've got to get us started. But yeah, please do type in your questions, and we'll spend most of the balance of our time together on those questions. So first of all, thank you for that, and for your ongoing efforts, your work on this topic, obviously, for sharing it with us today. For those of us in the audience for whom a relatively obscure urban design project in Hamburg, Germany seems pretty far afield, I want to start there, right? So you mentioned the Hafenburg project. In my line of work in urban design, landscape architecture, this is of course a central, case study for decades now.
Yeah.
Where I want to begin is with, the damming of the Charles River and the so-called invention of the Charles River. Of course, the Charles River was this kind of muddy estuary and kind of oyster bed and kind of mucky area for centuries, if not millennia, until in the 1890s, a group of boosters in this fair city decided that they were going to organize it into a proper river, led by, among others, designer Charles Eliot, one of the founders of landscape architecture in this country. Charles Eliot's example, the model that he used in thinking about the Charles River Basin, was to look precisely at the Ulster Basin in Hamburg from earlier in the 19th century. So there's a long history of Boston-based designers and planners looking to Hamburg in particular, among other European examples, for this kind of model. And again, for those of you that don't know the case study, it's perfectly reasonable in terms of its real estate pro forma. It generates great profit. It does a lot of other things that we might talk about. Of course, there are cultural differences, geographic and hydrological differences as well. But in that context, it's interesting to me, Joan, your focus, obviously, most of your comments were about governance, and most of that focused on the public sector. You outlined, I thought, quite clearly and quite lucidly how, forms of governance are not really aligned to both the scale and the structure of these kinds of challenges. That, first of all, we don't have the tools. Our administrative structures are not aligned in the way that the problem emerges. And we start with the basic fact that most of the land that we're talking about, are these shores, are not publicly owned. So we know that 1,500 miles of coastline, the vast majority of it filled in marshes. And when we look at Cape Ann, the most vulnerable sites as we model storm event and sea level rise, of course, are those places that historically been filled. And Cape Ann's highly crenellated coastline is equally more vulnerable. And I would argue, because of the distribution, the relative thinly distributed population and economic capacity, it makes it even more problematic than any one set piece. But as you say, not even in Boston Harbor do we have either the big kind of engineering solutions nor the funding to be able to respond at scale. Knowing that you focused most of your comments today on the public sector, I want to ask you about, what do you think of as the role for the private sector broadly? So we're in a city in which, of course, we have great economic throughput. Industries are thriving. What about the private sector, individual landowners? What about the various cultural and educational institutions that grace our fair city? Is there a complementary role that you see in this vis-a-vis governance for the private sector and for institutions?
There has to be. There has to be a role for the private sector, absolutely. Um, and just continuing the comparison with Haven City, I mean, one of the things is that because the city was the major owner of the land, they had leverage with the developers to say, here's the standards, here's how you're going to build, and if you want to build here, you're going to do it. Boston doesn't have that leverage in the sense of owning the land, but I think that was such hot property in the seaport. And, they practically had developers lined up wanting to build there, that they could have used their power in the public sector to demand more. And so they had certain voluntary requirements, and some of the buildings, everyone points to Spalding Hospital as, the key example. But I think in growth cities, cities shouldn't be afraid to use their leverage to demand more from the private sector. But I think the Wharf District Council is an example of, where a group of property owners are acting to improve their neighborhood in the absence of anything else going on and happening. Now, whether they're going to be able to implement and, where the funding comes from those, I don't know. But that's why I think public-private partnerships have to be part of whatever regional or state governance agency that is developed. But in terms of, you can't just do it on a property by property basis with, private property owners protecting their particular property, because obviously it has impacts for the surrounding property. So it has to be done in that kind of private public partnership mode.
And require, extended levels of coordination, a kind of coordination that, we are not always really set up to do in our particular cultural formation. I think there are two precedents in our work in the Office of Urbanization that come to mind that might be relevant here. So the first would be Greater Miami. Mentioned, Virginia's outer coast and its vulnerability. Miami may be among the more vulnerable metropolitan areas in the U.S. In that context, the city of Miami Beach has been on a program of elevating by about 24 inches much of its public realm. It's also seeing water in the streets, clear blue sky, kind of day flooding, so-called nuisance flooding in a state where you can't utter the term climate change. And so in that, the public sector is acting a priori well ahead of individual landowners, and that produces all manner of downstream problems, as you might imagine, from physical access to liability to questions of responsibility and ongoing economic viability. The other example that comes to mind, as you mentioned, the place where Hamburg owned the land, spent 6 years on the design review panel of the Toronto Waterfront Development Corporation. This was a crown corporation. It was a share between the federal government in Canada, the province, and the city of Toronto. But they had this, hundreds of acres of brownfield land made available on Lake Ontario, but they owned much of it. And the fact that they owned much of it, combined with the relative desirability of real estate in Toronto on the waterfront these days, produced a condition where they felt as though they could demand some large percentage of affordable, less than market rate subsidized housing. They could afford, LEED standards. They could afford to have certain climate resilience expectations built in. But as you say, in many Massachusetts communities and many cities in the US, if the political class is really working on behalf of the development class, and real estate development is one of the primary economic drivers, that's a big challenge. No, I mean, are there models that we can look at where real estate development can be seen to be allies in this process?
Well, that's an interesting question. So let's go back to Miami. There's accusations of climate gentrification, right? And it's not like Boston Harbor. You can't build any kind of barrier unless you build it right on the land to protect Miami or the whole Florida Peninsula for that matter. And we're seeing a lot of high-end development go inland. And so some could say, oh, that's climate gentrification. Now that the rich people can't live on the coast anymore because of the nuisance flooding, they're moving in. And I think it's a little more complicated than that, in that I think some developers are seeing problems with getting insurance on properties that are built in vulnerable areas. I think what insurance company just pulled out of Florida? One of the major ones just pulled out of Florida, and that's a tide that's going to keep getting higher in terms of that happening. And so, what will be the solution in Miami? How can there be public cooperation? So you see cooperation in the sense that developers are already saying, yeah, we've got to build inland, but then you've got the equity question, because where they're going inland are what were traditionally ethnic, lower income ethnic neighborhoods. And so the equity issue is always going to pop up in those kinds of
Yeah. I can say as a native Florida, I was born and raised in Florida. I think the count is now a half dozen major national insurers have left the state, including most recently Farmers.
Yeah. And that's going to drive a lot, right? Because if you can't get it insured, you're not going to build. So, a lot of these development decisions may be decided by the insurance industry. Not maybe.
On that topic, I mean, I guess I would say a couple of things. We had the pleasure of being one of the faculty members on a municipal response to climate adaptation course offered here at Harvard a couple of years ago with colleagues from the law school, from the Kennedy School, from engineering, and from planning. And I learned quite a lot in that course, I can say, going in as a designer, as an architect and urbanist. Among the things that I learned was that in that tabletop exercise, it wasn't the MWRA that they found was maybe the most likely model for this kind of government restructuring that could intervene, but many of the case studies that were examined suggested that it was the tollway authority that provided a kind of precedent, which had a kind of eminent domain, let's call it, but also the ability to generate its own funding, a certain kind of cross-disciplinary or cross-siloed mandate. I wonder if that's is that ironic? Is that heartening? Like, how should we view that? I mean, MWRA and Tollway Authority are quite different organizations, obviously, but they might share some aspects.
Well, generating their own revenue, certainly. I smile because in one of my courses last week, we just had the whole Robert Moses in New York discussion. And of course, Robert Moses used the Triborough Bridge Authority that allowed him to build all kinds of new roads. So in terms of a tollway authority and generating a lot of money, that would certainly be it. I'm not really familiar with how the powers that tollway authorities have. I mean, Robert Moses had a way of capturing power that I don't know is replicable, or I don't know if anyone would want it to be. So I'm not sure.
Well, you mentioned also there's often a space, a gap, as a space between policy and practice, right? That's another thing I think that we should introduce here that I've seen certainly in Cape Ann and in my experience in the Commonwealth. That is, on the one hand, we seem to have plenty of policy. Maybe it's not maybe the right policy, but at the same moment, we seem to have plenty of administration. But at the same moment, often exceptions, right? So many of the conditions that we've been studying on Cape Ann arise out of permitting processes that are lax. You mentioned several of those in the context of Boston, or exceptions that are allowed because, well, this is a unique condition. Much of the presentation, I think, has focused on the kind of the public sector reorganizing itself at various levels. Would it be fair to say that individuals and institutions are already acting individually? Is that a fair assessment of the state of play in a place like Boston?
Say some are, but I don't necessarily think that individuals have the resources, to protect themselves or their property. So no, I don't see that being the case. Do you?
It's a formulation that I've come around to, in part to, in the context of what you described as a culture of home rule, which I think, is it's a nice way of summing up my experience in this part of the world, in which the idea of, communities being managed to retreat does not seem germane or specific to the culture. Let's put it that way, right? Having said that, there are these examples where, people come together, particularly in the face of particular contexts or crises. So it's in that context that what I see are certainly in terms of real estate pro forma, the mortgage reinsurance markets, markets are beginning already. And certainly in terms of the longer term, planning of institutions, I see evidence on some basis, it's anecdotal, that institutions, especially those that have a very long horizon and have big land holdings and big exposure, are beginning to think about, how they might respond. Having said that, it certainly doesn't produce the kind of public discourse that you've been engaged in. It certainly doesn't produce the kind of governmental restructuring or cultural reorientation that might be more public, let's say. I see that we're getting a number of good questions in the chat, so that's good.
Yes, it looks like we have several questions along this similar line of actors that are involved and beyond just the public-private sector, but also, as we were mentioning earlier, talking about insurance companies and their agency within this conversation. And as well as investment banks to back projects at all scales.
That's right. So let me go ahead, sir.
No, finish it up, Charles.
That was going to be my last question, which is, Jen, I'm interested in your thoughts about to the extent that we have not only the wrong administrative structure, perhaps not the right policies or incentives, not sufficient staffing or technical knowledge. Do we have perverse, incentives? One of the things I learned in moving to town was that the Commonwealth requires people who are underwriting mortgages to do so even on the Cape, both Cape Ann and Cape Cod, in places where that might be that person's third home, for example, in the kind of extreme case that you showed. You mentioned the New Jersey example of eminent domain. The science is incontrovertible. The mapping and the study of where these places are going to flood is quite knowable. And at the same time, the impediment to thinking about change and the impediment to thinking about that kind of concentrated state power in the context of eminent domain, for example, much less managed retreat, seems quite anathema in terms of the political economy of the city. But are there perverse incentives that we could undo, or that you could imagine policy changes that would be ameliorative?
Well, at the federal level, we still are subsidizing insurance for just those properties you talk about. And when there was an attempt to stop doing that, of course, insurance rates went up 25%. It was mostly wealthy homeowners, and they stopped it. And so, yeah, in terms of, it's very, very difficult to get the kind of policy incentives in place. And just making, okay, if you want to live there, you're going to pay the full cost of your insurance, would seem a bare minimum, right? That should be put in place, not subsidizing that insurance. And right, if you look at FEMA and how many are, 3, 4, 5 time users of funds to rebuild. And, it is kind of American culture. So, whether you're in Hurricane Alley or Tornado Alley, that we're going to rebuild. And at some point, you just have to say it doesn't make sense to rebuild in places that are so vulnerable.
The formulation I've come around to, which I'm not sure, how it lands through your ears, but my formulation is that we have a de facto right of return. There's very few political actors in the wake of Sandy or in the wake of Katrina that can prevent a community from rebuilding. And it's in part because of the lessons that we've learned, the failures of modernism and the sins of our grandparents. So we're going to move to questions now. I'm going to take the first one, and then Sarah, I'll turn to you, and you can then begin to kind of either bunch them together or give them to us in some kind of coherent sequence. So the first question out of the box by Tom. Tom, thanks for joining us. Why would properties on the Charles River flood where a dam regulates the level of the river? And I'll start, Joan, you can feel free to weigh in, but I can tell you from my own studies and our students' work on this and various research projects that the Charles River is, of course, a regulated basin. We have some, 18 inches, some two double figures of freeboard left on that dam. It will have to be raised eventually in the fullness of time. But what I can tell you is that in the context of Boston's, drumlin geology and its particular geography, For the first couple of feet of sea level rise in a simple bathtub model, things are pretty linear. It's old wetlands and it's marsh and it's coast and it moves inland. And of course, the Charles River being regulated both upstream and at the dam allows for the management of that in the exception of certain storm events. But beyond about 40 inches or so, precisely the metric for 2070 that you mentioned, Joan, things get very nonlinear very quickly. And things like the Big Dig produce an enormous rush of water into places that you would not have expected it. So it's not always just the flooding of the Back Bay coming from the Charles River, but it's in fact water coming in through our transportation systems and other mechanisms. And so in that regard, things get very nonlinear, non-obvious fairly quickly at 4 or 5 feet of sea level rise or storm event. Joan, do you want to add anything to that? Is that a fair assessment?
I think very fair assessment. I have nothing to add to that.
Excellent. So Sarah, what should we talk about next? Why don't you curate some of these questions for us?
Yeah, we have several questions that are, again, talking about actors, I guess, across the public and private sector, and then multiple scales of agency and intervention. And a lot of questions about communication between all these actors. So Joan, do you have any insights on examples where interesting communication platforms have been created or you've seen successful communication? Items. Yeah.
I haven't been reading the questions, so I'm not sure when you talk about communication, what you mean here.
Yeah. So we have lots of questions that are talking about both the funding that's available from the perspective of investment banks who are going through commercial and residential mortgages and scrutinizing them, and how also insurance companies who are going through this process and going through claims. And so like, are these actors being engaged by both the public and private sector and like have a seat at the table? Have you seen examples where they have a seat at the table?
I can't speak to that. The only process that I know that I mentioned in the Wharf District, where there's, lots of people communicating directly and deciding on that area. I don't know the extent to which that's insurance companies deciding on that as well.
I would direct that question. I think it's a lucid question, but it's a challenging one. I'd direct it to the work of Dr. Jesse Keenan at Tulane and one of our previous conversations. I would say something that Keenan echoes, which is often, whether it's insurance or reinsurance companies or other REIT funds or other actors, they have a very specific fiduciary interest in maintaining the proprietary aspect of their knowledge. That is, they're not incentivized. In fact, they're punished for sharing that information, right? So in that sense, again, we're back up against some bigger structural challenges. One of the questions has to do with the relative values of density, right? So we've been talking a lot about kind of existing urban form of Boston. We had this opportunity, it's once in a generation opportunity for the seaport and its redevelopment. Does density and new development, increased density or putting greater spatial planning parameters around density or development, does that help? And especially in coastal cities, are there general recommendations about zoning or development policy that we could advise?
Yeah, well, I think the density question often, most of my work is actually on mitigation side of things. And so we argue a lot for denser development around transportation hubs, transit-oriented development and so forth, which bring a lot of benefits in terms of walkability, bikeability, more use of public transportation, social aspects of that, being close to other people. So generally, we as a profession, as urban planners, do promote a lot of density. I think, I don't think that's the problem with the seaport. So again, if you look at Huffin City, that everyone looks to, it's every bit as dense in the building space, but it has all these features building in. So I don't think density is a barrier to resilience of a particular neighborhood.
You mentioned, in fact, in your comments, many municipalities, many jurisdictions are effectively using new development to help fund whatever possible mitigation or adaptation might be available, right? And that's certainly the model I've seen in most US cities, absent the Department of Defense or some other federal actor. Most often what I see is new development and perhaps increased densities. We've seen this in South Florida being used to pay for public realm, both defense and public space amenity.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Gregory Federspiel joins us. Greg, thanks for all your support from Manchester by the Sea. Greg writes, there is a real tension, and you would know, running a municipality, between potential regional efforts versus local preferences, this business of home rule, and the local political will to take action. Do you, Joan, have insights on how to resolve that tension?
Well, I think that's something that has to be baked into any kind of regional authority. When we talk about a state agency, I think there has to be, with that, some kind of regional aspect to it. And so, yes, you don't want a state agency coming in, applying rules, potentially using eminent domain and making decisions on one hand. On the other hand, it's the Commonwealth that would be raising a lot of the funding and then looking at the areas of most need. So there's definitely going to be controversy over that. And it's just a matter of how the participatory process is structured from the very beginning, because there's so much mistrust of government and participation where community input is asked for.
Well, I'm glad you used the air quotes there. I want to ask you about that. I mean, let me phrase it as a question, right? What confidence do we have in the models for civic engagement on these topics? I can say, from my experience on these issues, we've internalized the failures of modern projects. You mentioned Robert Moses, and we've internalized. I think the first slide I saw in architecture school was the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe, right? And so the failure of the modern project and the sins of our grandparents. Having internalized that, we do see various formats and strategies for consultation or participation. How would you characterize the state of play in that regard from your perspective?
I characterize it as there's a set of cities, perhaps small, that have realized that they haven't gotten it right. So the development agency comes in and says, here's what we're thinking of doing, which is really what they are going to do. What do you think of this? And they get all this input, and then they go and do what they were going to do anyway, right? Planning is known for that. I have a piece, an article in the Journal of the American Planning Association that examined 5 cities that when they updated their climate action plan, they were either climate equity or climate justice plans. And one of the first things they realized that we as a profession, urban planners, have been part of the problem. And the first aspect of it was building a participatory process. So in Providence, Rhode Island, they went so far as to exclude some of the normal people that come, to a planning process and really put it exclusively in the hands of community, which had its own controversy, as you can imagine, afterwards. But, in Austin, Texas, one of the cities I looked at, the director of sustainability explained in their previous plan, it took 2 weeks to get community input. They spent 2 months just deciding and reaching out to get the community input, and then they were part of the planning process for the whole thing. And so, as we know, the problem with community input is it takes longer and it slows things down. And what I hear from people in frontline communities is, it makes me crazy when everyone talks about urgency, 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 because I immediately know then the input and the process of getting to an agreeable goal is going to be compromised.
Definitely. And along those lines, we have more questions, both from Maureen and Valerie, who are on KPN. Thank you both for being here today, that are talking about community engagement and public engagement. And so one is how to discuss manage retreat with a community and how to take first steps in that conversation. And then other is talking about the equitable distribution of sacrifices and how to bring up that conversation.
Yeah, so far we haven't had that conversation in Massachusetts. I point again to the toolkit that the Georgetown Climate Center has developed. And basically what it is about, it's about developing the process, making sure that the community has not just a voice, but that the community is represented. So you wouldn't go into East Boston and choose, one organization and say this represents East Boston, but to really get a mixture of people that are involved in that process, and actually implementing some of the solutions that they propose. And those solutions may not be the ones that the city would have prioritized, but if you're going to open up a process of participation, be prepared to deprioritize, the agenda that the city or the state has going in. So, other than that kind of process, I think that's what we need to do in terms of equitable distribution. Whether that's enough, whether the powers that be, prioritize those who give most to campaigns, we'll see how that plays out. I don't have a silver bullet answer for how we make sure there's equitable. I can only say we need a process to try to ensure that happens.
Well, thank you for those points. Those are great. And we have another question from Kira. Thank you, Kira, for your insight. And it's directed towards about funding. So it's saying, how could you talk a bit about how funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and recently announced Climate Corp's align with its shift in governance? Is there any incentive for smaller communities or towns with smaller populations to begin pilot projects immediately to take advantage of that funding?
I think there's planning funds before the pilot projects that come from the IRA. But, it goes back to one of my first points about insufficient staffing. And, small communities need a lot of help in applying for that funding. Similarly, there's state funds that are available. And we have a lot of places that get repeat funding because they just have more capacity to engage in the planning. And so, I think universities are trying to reach out, and it's something I hear all the time about the need to help these small communities so that they can apply for the first round of funding, because you have to get in on the planning funding then to get implementation funding down the line.
Thank you so much, Joan. And it looks like we are almost to the end of our time. So do we have any last points that we want to end on?
I was going to just pick up on that last part, which is, on the one hand, Joan, I can infer, you've implied that this in some ways becomes a zero-sum game for both state and federal funding, and we've already postulated that the Commonwealth doesn't have enough funding to pay for its own exposure, much less the federal government for all of the Eastern Seaboard. Is a part of your advocacy for the state taking a greater role, or the Commonwealth taking a greater role in this compared to individual actors of municipalities or counties, is a part of that based on this question of equity? What I hear you saying is that we'll have greater opportunity for distribution of resources, a greater understanding of the collective shared threats, and maybe an eye on a greater equitable outcomes if the state is more present as an actor. Is that a part of your argument?
Absolutely. I think there are many small communities that just don't have the resources to apply for the funds, plan, and that they would get much needed assistance in this. So it shouldn't be about, Boston and other larger cities getting most of the resources. So I do think that the state would make it a more equitable process. And particularly, I think this state government that we have now, I think is very, concerned about a lot of equity in implementation, both in the mitigation sphere and the adaptation sphere.
And this makes, feel free to back this one back at me, but could you imagine a future in which a progressive Justice Department at the federal level takes on environmental injustice and climate equity questions in the way that civil rights was kind of brought up decades ago?
I see it more in, for example, the Justice 40 initiative that is in the federal programs is where that is going to be, where there's a guarantee that a certain amount goes to frontline communities. That could be replicated at the state level. I don't know. It's just that going through the courts is always takes so long. And so I think, what we have now with Justice 40, if that gets implemented in a timely way and communities really start to see funds coming in, that that's the more effective way to redress the whole history of what the federal government has created in our cities.
No doubt. And our function, we on our research on Cape Ann began our work with what we call a scenario zero. We do a kind of steady state, assume we do nothing to change the existing system, and we modeled a synthetic future storm. So as you may know, the Gulf of Maine has been relatively spared from tropical storms and hurricanes for about a half century for a variety of very interesting and peculiar reasons. Of course, they deal with nor'easters all the time, and Cape Anners are a resilient, hardy bunch, but they've been there for 400 years as such. And, it's granite, it's literally built out of rock, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But one of the questions that we want to get to is really, we've been talking about this in the context of longue durée and sea level rise incrementally and political response and organization of civil society. In the context of an extreme storm event, we saw Hurricane Lee in the Gulf of Maine 2 weeks ago. We know that there will be increased intensity of tropical storms and hurricanes. Would an extreme weather event change either your recommendations or the way that you see things playing out in Massachusetts?
Well, I think I saw someone in the chat ask about, or question and answers ask about just that. Do you need an extreme weather event to motivate people? And that's exactly what we're seeing. That's what happened in Hamburg. That's what motivated the Dutch how many years ago to act. That's what motivated New York. That's why they're so far ahead of Boston. And so maybe that's it. Although on the other hand, when you look at the climate denial going on around the heat waves and so forth, that's picking up before the COP meetings in November, calling it a heat wave scam. And so, you've got naysayers and people out there on the other side that are, spreading the idea that these are scams, that it really isn't. So it's kind of amazing to me with fires, hurricanes, all that's going on, heat waves, that people can still deny. So I would think, a storm would motivate people to act, but can't always rely on that.
I suppose. Well, we shall hope for good weather, both here and on Cape Ann. Dr. Joan Fitzgerald, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for all of your contributions to this. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. So the webinar has been recorded. It'll be posted both to Town Green, Water Allowance, and other venues, and also on the Office of Urbanization website in the fullness of time. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.